Which American president made the most expensive military decision in history? Which one led the deadliest war Americans ever fought? And which president took the country into a conflict that is still debated today? The answers span more than 2 centuries of American history. From the War of 1812 to the conflicts of the modern era, these are the presidents who led America into war. Before we begin, one thing to remember. Not every war on this list was officially declared by Congress, but every conflict fundamentally changed America's place in the world.
In April 1945, America is still at war with Hitler and the Japanese. To add to the complications, Truman has been vice president for just 3 months.
The Americans razed entire cities. Alongside traditional munitions, napalm was used, a chemical that burns skin to the bone.
We have hit hundreds of targets in Iran, including Revolutionary Guard facility. They are the world's #1 state sponsor of terror. We are the world's greatest and most powerful nation, so we can do something about what they do.
Our story begins with America's first major war after independence. Nearly 30 years had passed since the Revolutionary War, but relations with Britain remained tense. American ships were being seized at sea, trade was under pressure, and many politicians believed British actions could no longer be ignored. At the center of the growing crisis was President James Madison. But in 1812, he would make a decision that pushed the young United States into a war against the most powerful empire on earth. At the time, Britain was locked in a massive struggle against Napoleon's France. The Royal Navy controlled much of the world's oceans, and American ships often found themselves caught in the middle. For years, American leaders had watched British warships stop U.S. merchant vessels, seize cargo, and even force American sailors into British service. To many Americans, it felt like an attack on the nation's sovereignty. But there was another issue. Along the western frontier, American settlers were increasingly coming into conflict with Native American tribes. Many politicians in Washington believed Britain was secretly supplying weapons and support to tribes resisting American expansion. By 1812, pressure on Madison was growing. Young members of Congress, known as the War Hawks, argued that America could no longer tolerate British actions. Some even believed the United States could seize Canada and permanently weaken British influence in North America. On June 18, 1812, President Madison signed the Declaration of War. The United States had officially gone to war with Great Britain. What followed was far more difficult than many Americans expected. Early military campaigns ended in failure. Attempts to invade Canada repeatedly collapsed. American forces struggled with poor leadership, weak logistics, and limited training. Then came one of the most humiliating moments in U.S. history. In August 1814, British troops marched into Washington, D.C. Government officials fled the city. The Capitol was set on fire. And for the first and only time in American history, the White House itself was burned by a foreign army. Images of flames rising above the nation's capital shocked Americans across the country. Yet despite these setbacks, the war did not end in defeat. American forces achieved important victories in the final stages of the conflict, helping restore national confidence. The most famous came at the Battle of New Orleans, where future President Andrew Jackson became a national hero. When the war finally ended, neither side had achieved all of its objectives. But something had changed. The United States had survived a second war against Britain and emerged with a stronger sense of national identity. For James Madison, the conflict was controversial and costly. Yet historians often view the War of 1812 as the moment America proved it could defend its independence against one of the most powerful nations in the world. It was America's first major test on the global stage, and it would not be the last. If James Madison proved America could survive against a great power, the next president on our list would dramatically expand the nation's borders, and in the process, he would oversee one of the most controversial wars in American history. When James K. Polk entered the White House in 1845, the United States was already growing rapidly, but Polk had a much bigger vision. He believed America was destined to stretch from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific. At the time, many Americans supported an idea known as manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was meant to expand across North America. The problem was that much of that territory belonged to Mexico. Tensions were already high over Texas. A few years earlier, Texas had won its independence from Mexico and operated as its own republic. But when the United States annexed Texas in 1845, Mexico refused to recognize the move. The disagreement quickly became even more dangerous. The United States claimed the southern border of Texas was the Rio Grande River. Mexico argued that the border was much farther north. Between those two rivers lay disputed territory claimed by both nations. President Polk sent American troops into the area. Soon afterward, Mexican and American soldiers clashed. Several American troops were killed. Polk responded by telling Congress that American blood had been shed on American soil. Congress approved war. In May 1846, the United States and Mexico were officially at war. What followed was a military campaign that transformed North America. American forces advanced on multiple fronts. They captured key cities in northern Mexico. Naval forces helped secure California. And in one of the war's most dramatic operations, General Winfield Scott launched an amphibious invasion near Veracruz before marching hundreds of miles inland toward Mexico City. By September 1847, American troops had entered the Mexican capital. Mexico was forced to negotiate. The result was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. The agreement gave the United States control of an enormous amount of territory. The land acquired included present-day California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, and large portions of several other western states. It was one of the largest territorial expansions in American history. For supporters of Polk, the war fulfilled the dream of a nation stretching from coast to coast. But critics saw something very different. Many argued that the conflict had been engineered to acquire land and expand American power. A young congressman named Abraham Lincoln openly questioned Polk's justification for the war. Others warned that the newly acquired territories would reignite the national debate over slavery. In many ways, they were right. The land gained during the Mexican-American War would eventually deepen divisions between North and South, helping set the stage for the Civil War only a decade later. By the time James K. Polk left office, America had become vastly larger than when he arrived. Few presidents have altered the map of the United States as dramatically, but the consequences of that expansion would shape the country's future for generations. The territory was won, the borders were expanded, but a far greater conflict was already beginning to take shape inside the nation itself, and the next president on our list would face that challenge head-on. By the time Abraham Lincoln took office in March 1861, the United States was already falling apart. Several southern states had announced they were leaving the Union. Politicians were trading threats instead of compromises. Across the country, many Americans feared that the nation founded less than a century earlier might not survive. The crisis had been building for decades. As the United States expanded westward, a difficult question followed every new territory that joined the country. Would slavery be allowed there? Northern states increasingly opposed the expansion of slavery, while many Southern leaders believed their economy and way of life depended on it. With each passing year, the divide grew deeper. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election of 1860, many Southern politicians saw it as a turning point. Although Lincoln repeatedly stated that he did not intend to abolish slavery where it already existed, his opposition to its expansion convinced many in the South that their influence in Washington was coming to an end. Before Lincoln had even settled into the White House, 7 states had already declared their secession and formed the Confederate States of America. The situation reached a breaking point on April 12, 1861. Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The American Civil War had begun. What followed was unlike anything the country had ever experienced. Brother fought against brother. Families were divided. Entire communities found themselves on opposite sides of the conflict. The Union led by Lincoln's government, fought to preserve the United States as a single nation. The Confederacy fought for independence and the right of states to govern themselves, with slavery remaining at the center of the dispute. As the war dragged on, casualties mounted at a staggering rate. Battles such as Gettysburg, Antietam, and Shiloh left tens of thousands dead or wounded. New technologies made warfare more lethal than ever before. By 1863, Lincoln made one of the most significant decisions of his presidency. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were to be considered free. The war was no longer only about preserving the Union. It had also become a struggle over slavery itself. After 4 years of brutal fighting, Union forces finally prevailed in 1865. The Confederacy collapsed. Slavery was abolished, and the United States remained united. But the cost was enormous. More than 600,000 Americans are estimated to have died, making the Civil War the deadliest conflict in the nation's history, greater than the combined American deaths of World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. For Abraham Lincoln, victory came at a tragic price. Just days after the war ended, he was assassinated while attending a play in Washington, D.C. Yet his legacy endured. He had preserved the Union at its moment of greatest danger and helped bring an end to slavery in the United States. No president before him had faced a greater threat to the nation's survival, and few would ever face one again. By the end of the Civil War, the United States had survived its greatest internal crisis. But in the decades that followed, a new question emerged. Would America remain focused on its own continent, or would it begin projecting power beyond its borders? In 1897, William McKinley entered the White House at a time when tensions were growing just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Cuba was still under Spanish control, but Cuban rebels had been fighting for independence for years. Reports of harsh Spanish military tactics filled American newspapers, and public sympathy for the Cuban cause continued to grow. At first, McKinley was cautious. He preferred diplomacy over war and hoped the crisis could be resolved peacefully. But events soon began moving beyond anyone's control. On the night of February 15, 1898, an American battleship called the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor. More than 260 sailors were killed. The exact cause of the explosion remains debated even today. However, many Americans immediately blamed Spain. Newspapers across the country ran dramatic headlines demanding action. Public pressure for war exploded almost overnight. Within weeks, the United States and Spain were on a collision course. In April 1898, Congress declared war. What followed surprised much of the world. Spain had once been one of history's greatest empires, but by the late 19th century, its power was fading. The United States, meanwhile, had become an industrial giant with growing military capabilities. The conflict lasted only a few months. American forces achieved victories in both the Caribbean and the Pacific. In Cuba, U.S. troops fought alongside Cuban rebels against Spanish forces. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, American naval forces destroyed a major Spanish fleet in Manila Bay. By the summer of 1898, it was clear that Spain could no longer continue the fight. The war ended with a decisive American victory. Under the peace agreement, Spain gave up control of several territories, including Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Cuba gained independence, although the United States would continue to exert significant influence over the island for years to come. For many Americans, the war was a moment of national pride. The United States had defeated a European empire and demonstrated that it could project military power far beyond its own shores. But not everyone celebrated. Critics argued that acquiring overseas territories contradicted America's founding principles. Others warned that the country was beginning to act like the empires it had once opposed. Those debates would continue for decades. What could not be denied was the war's impact. Before 1898, the United States was largely seen as a regional power. After 1898, it was increasingly viewed as a rising force on the global stage. For President William McKinley, the Spanish-American War marked a turning point, not just in his presidency, but in American history itself. The United States had entered the war to confront Spain. It emerged as a nation with global ambitions, and the 20th century was only beginning. In 1916, President Woodrow Wilson was re-elected with a simple message: he kept us out of war. Across Europe, millions of soldiers were already fighting and dying in what would become known as the First World War. Entire cities had been destroyed, empires were beginning to collapse, and the casualty numbers were unlike anything the modern world had ever seen. Most Americans wanted no part of it, and for a while, Wilson agreed. When World War I began in 1914, the United States officially declared its neutrality. Wilson believed America should remain above the conflict, acting as a mediator rather than a participant. Many Americans supported this position. After all, the war was taking place thousands of miles away, and few saw a reason to send American soldiers into a European battlefield. But staying neutral proved far more difficult than Wilson had expected. Although America was officially neutral, trade with the Allied powers, particularly Britain and France, continued to grow. American banks provided loans, American factories supplied goods, and American ships crossed the Atlantic carrying valuable cargo. Germany saw this differently. To break Britain's naval blockade, Germany increasingly relied on submarines, known as U-boats. Unlike traditional warships, U-boats could strike without warning. Soon, American vessels found themselves in danger. The situation escalated dramatically in 1915 when a German submarine sank the British passenger ship Lusitania. Nearly 1,200 people died, including 128 Americans. The sinking shocked the United States. Many Americans who had supported neutrality began questioning whether Germany could be trusted. Yet even then, Wilson resisted entering the war. For nearly 2 more years, he continued searching for a diplomatic solution. Then in early 1917, Germany made a decision that changed everything. German leaders resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning virtually any ship entering certain waters could be attacked. At almost the same time, British intelligence intercepted a secret message from Germany to Mexico. Known today as the Zimmermann telegram, the message proposed an alliance between Germany and Mexico if the United States entered the war against Germany. When the telegram became public, outrage spread across America. For many citizens, neutrality no longer seemed possible. Wilson reached the same conclusion. On April 2, 1917, he stood before Congress and asked for a declaration of war. Just days later, the United States officially entered World War I. American troops began arriving in Europe in large numbers. Their arrival provided a major boost to exhausted Allied forces that had already spent years fighting in brutal trench warfare. By late 1918, Germany and its allies were running out of options. On November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. The First World War had ended. More than 16 million people had died worldwide. For the United States, the war marked a turning point. Before World War I, America had largely remained on the sidelines of European conflicts. After World War I, it was increasingly viewed as one of the world's most influential powers. For Woodrow Wilson, however, the victory was complicated. The president who had campaigned on keeping America out of war had ultimately led the nation into one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. And although the fighting ended in 1918, many of the political tensions left behind would eventually contribute to an even larger war only 2 decades later. The world believed it had witnessed the war to end all wars. Instead, it was only the beginning of a far more turbulent century. When Franklin D. Roosevelt became president in 1933, America was struggling to survive the Great Depression. Millions were unemployed, businesses had collapsed, and the last thing most Americans wanted was another war in Europe. But across the Atlantic, a new threat was already taking shape. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party were rapidly expanding their power. By the late 1930s, Hitler had already annexed Austria, occupied Czechoslovakia, and in September 1939, invaded Poland. Within days, Britain and France declared war. World War II had begun. Despite the growing crisis overseas, the United States remained officially neutral. Roosevelt understood the danger Hitler posed, but convincing the American public to support another European war was nearly impossible. Instead, he looked for other ways to help America's allies. Through programs like Lend-Lease, the United States supplied Britain, China, and later the Soviet Union with billions of dollars worth of weapons, vehicles, food, and military equipment without officially entering the war. For nearly 2 years, America stayed out of direct combat. Then everything changed. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, hundreds of Japanese aircraft launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In less than 2 hours, battleships were sunk, aircraft were destroyed, and more than 2,400 Americans were killed. The attack shocked the nation. The following day, Roosevelt stood before Congress and delivered one of the most famous speeches in American history, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Congress overwhelmingly voted to declare war on Japan. Just days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. America was now fully involved in World War II. Over the next 4 years, the United States transformed itself into what many historians call the arsenal of democracy. Factories that once produced cars began building tanks, bombers, and warships. Millions of Americans joined the armed forces, while millions more worked in factories supporting the war effort. American troops fought across North Africa, Italy, the Pacific Islands, and eventually Western Europe. Then came one of the most significant military operations in history. On June 6, 1944, better known as D-Day, more than 150,000 Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy in Nazi-occupied France. It became one of the largest and most significant military landings in history. This operation marked a major turning point in the effort to restore freedom across Western Europe. Within the following year, Allied forces advanced into Germany. In April 1945, the leadership of Nazi Germany came to an end as the war reached its final stage. A short time later, Germany officially surrendered, bringing the European conflict to a close. The war in Europe had finally ended. Meanwhile, the conflict in the Pacific continued until August 1945. After the use of 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan announced its surrender, officially bringing World War II to an end. By the conclusion of the war, more than 60 million people around the world had lost their lives, making it the deadliest conflict in recorded history. For President Franklin Roosevelt, however, the war's conclusion came too late. After guiding the United States through the Great Depression and most of World War II, Roosevelt passed away on April 12, 1945. Only a few weeks before Germany's surrender, he did not live to witness the final Allied victory that he had worked toward for years. Even so, his impact on history was undeniable. Under Roosevelt's leadership, the United States played a central role in the Allied victory, emerged as one of the world's leading powers, and helped shape the modern international order. By the end of World War II, America had become the leading force of the Western world. Although the war had ended, a new period of global rivalry was already beginning, one that would soon reshape international politics for decades to come. World War II had ended, but peace didn't last long. Nazi Germany had been defeated, Japan had surrendered. Yet instead of entering a new era of stability, the world quickly split into 2 rival camps. On one side stood the United States, on the other, the Soviet Union. What followed wasn't an official world war, but it would shape global politics for the next 4 decades. It became known as the Cold War. By 1945, Korea, once occupied by Japan, had been divided into 2 separate zones. The Soviet Union controlled the north. The United States supported the south. What was meant to be a temporary arrangement soon turned into a permanent political divide. In the north, Kim Il-sung established a communist government backed by Moscow. In the south, Syngman Rhee led a government supported by Washington. Neither side accepted the division. Both claimed to be the legitimate government of all Korea. Then on June 25, 1950, everything changed. Without warning, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and launched a full-scale invasion of South Korea. Within days, Seoul had fallen. The South Korean military was overwhelmed, and there were real fears that the entire peninsula would soon come under communist control. President Harry S. Truman faced one of the biggest decisions of his presidency. Many of his advisors believed that if the United States failed to respond, it would encourage further communist expansion, not only in Asia, but around the world. Truman agreed. Instead of asking Congress for a formal declaration of war, he described the mission as a police action carried out under the authority of the United Nations. It was a legal distinction, but for the hundreds of thousands of American troops who would soon arrive in Korea, the fighting was every bit as real as any war. The first months were disastrous. North Korean forces pushed American and South Korean troops into a small defensive area around Pusan. It appeared the war might be lost. Then, in September 1950, General Douglas MacArthur launched a daring amphibious landing at Incheon. The operation completely changed the course of the war. UN forces recaptured Seoul and advanced deep into North Korea, approaching the Chinese border. But victory was short-lived. In late 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops entered the war. The conflict suddenly shifted again. American and UN forces were forced into a difficult retreat, and fierce battles followed across the Korean peninsula. For the next 2 years, neither side could achieve a decisive breakthrough. The front lines barely moved. Instead, the war became a brutal battle of attrition. By the time an armistice was signed in July 1953, millions of soldiers and civilians had been killed. The border between North and South Korea remained almost exactly where it had been when the war began. Technically, the Korean War never ended. No formal peace treaty was ever signed. Even today, North and South Korea remain separated by one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world. For Harry Truman, the Korean War established a new American foreign policy. From that point forward, the United States would actively oppose the spread of communism around the globe, even if it meant fighting wars far from home. It was the first major military confrontation of the Cold War, and it set a precedent that would influence nearly every American president who followed. The guns in Korea had barely fallen silent before another conflict began to grow in Southeast Asia. Unlike Korea, however, the next war would divide not just a nation overseas, but the American people themselves. If the Korean War marked the beginning of the Cold War, Vietnam became the conflict that changed how Americans viewed war itself. It wasn't the longest war in U.S. history, but for millions of Americans, it became the most controversial. The roots of the Vietnam conflict stretched back to the 1950s. After French colonial rule collapsed, Vietnam was divided into two separate states. The North, led by Ho Chi Minh, was backed by the Soviet Union and China. The South was supported by the United States. Washington feared that if South Vietnam fell to communism, neighboring countries would soon follow, a theory known as the domino theory. For several years, America's involvement remained limited. Military advisors were sent to train South Vietnamese forces, but large-scale combat troops had not yet been deployed. That changed after Lyndon B. Johnson became president. In August 1964, reports emerged that North Vietnamese patrol boats had confronted American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. Although historians still debate exactly what happened during the second reported incident, the event became a turning point. Johnson asked Congress for broad authority to respond. The result was the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave the president sweeping powers to expand U.S. military operations in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. Within months, the conflict escalated dramatically. American aircraft began sustained bombing campaigns over North Vietnam. Soon afterward, U.S. combat troops arrived in large numbers. What had once been a limited advisory mission became a full-scale war. By 1968, more than 500,000 American soldiers were serving in Vietnam. The fighting proved unlike anything the U.S. military had faced before. Instead of conventional front lines, American troops fought a guerrilla war against the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces, often in dense jungles where identifying the enemy was extremely difficult. Despite America's overwhelming military superiority, victory remained elusive. Then came the Tet Offensive in 1968. Although U.S. and South Vietnamese forces eventually repelled the attacks, the scale of the offensive shocked the American public. Many people had been told that victory was close. The images on television suggested otherwise. For the first time in American history, millions of families watched the realities of war unfold nightly in their living rooms. Public opinion began to shift dramatically. Across the country, anti-war protests grew larger each year. University campuses became centers of political activism. Many young Americans questioned why the war was being fought and whether the sacrifices were worth the cost. Facing mounting criticism and a deeply divided nation, Johnson made a stunning announcement in March 1968. He declared that he would not seek another term as president. It was one of the most extraordinary political decisions in modern American history. The Vietnam War would continue under his successor, but Johnson's presidency had already become inseparable from the conflict. By the time the United States withdrew its combat forces years later, more than 58,000 American service members had lost their lives, and millions of Vietnamese civilians and soldiers had been killed. For Lyndon B. Johnson, Vietnam became a painful reminder that military power alone could not guarantee political success. The war reshaped American foreign policy, transformed public trust in government, and left scars that would endure for generations. Vietnam changed more than America's strategy. It changed the American people. And the next major conflict would test whether the United States had learned the lessons of that long and costly war. By the end of the Vietnam War, many believed America would avoid another major military conflict for years to come. But in the summer of 1990, a crisis in the Middle East forced the United States to make another difficult decision. This time, the objective was clear: defeat the invading army, liberate an ally, and leave. On August 2, 1990, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein ordered his military to invade neighboring Kuwait. Within hours, Iraqi forces overwhelmed the small country's defenses. Kuwait's government fled into exile, while Iraq claimed the country as its newest province. The invasion shocked the international community. If Iraq succeeded, Saddam Hussein would gain control over a significant share of the world's oil reserves, raising fears that he could threaten other countries in the Persian Gulf, including Saudi Arabia. For President George H.W. Bush, allowing that to happen was not an option. Unlike many previous conflicts, Bush focused on building an international coalition before taking military action. Over the following months, more than 30 countries joined the U.S.-led coalition. While the United Nations demanded that Iraq withdraw from Kuwait, Saddam Hussein refused. In response, the United States launched Operation Desert Shield, sending hundreds of thousands of American troops to Saudi Arabia to defend the kingdom and prepare for a possible offensive. For months, the world waited. Then, on January 17, 1991, the operation entered a new phase. The coalition launched Operation Desert Storm. The campaign began with one of the largest air offensives in modern military history. For weeks, coalition aircraft struck Iraqi air defenses, command centers, military bases, and armored formations. The goal was simple: cripple Iraq's military before a single coalition soldier crossed into Kuwait. When the ground assault finally began in late February, it moved with astonishing speed. Coalition forces outmaneuvered Iraqi defenses in a massive flanking attack through the desert, cutting off key escape routes and overwhelming Iraqi positions. Just 100 hours after the ground offensive started, President Bush announced that Kuwait had been liberated. The Gulf War was effectively over. Although the entire conflict lasted about 7 months from the invasion of Kuwait, the major combat phase of Operation Desert Storm lasted only 43 days, with the ground campaign ending in just 100 hours. For many Americans, it was a dramatic contrast to Vietnam. The coalition had achieved its military objectives quickly. Casualties were relatively low compared with previous wars, and the operation demonstrated the overwhelming technological superiority of the U.S. military. Yet the war also left unanswered questions. President Bush deliberately chose not to advance to Baghdad or remove Saddam Hussein from power. His administration believed that expanding the mission could destabilize the region and fracture the international coalition. It was a decision that would be debated for years. Just over a decade later, Saddam Hussein would once again become the focus of American military action, this time under a different President Bush. The Gulf War restored confidence in America's military after Vietnam, but the next conflict would become far longer, far more expensive, and far more controversial than anyone imagined. For more than a decade after the Gulf War, the United States enjoyed a period of relative peace and unmatched global influence. Then, on a clear Tuesday morning, everything changed. In less than 2 hours, America suffered the deadliest terrorist attack in its history. The decisions made in the weeks that followed would shape U.S. foreign policy for the next 2 decades. On the morning of September 11, 2001, 19 terrorists from the extremist group Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 commercial airliners. 2 planes struck the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. A third crashed into the Pentagon. The fourth, United Airlines Flight 93, crashed into a field in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back against the hijackers. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. It was the deadliest terrorist attack ever carried out on American soil. That evening, President George W. Bush addressed the nation. His message was direct. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. Within weeks, the United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom. The target was Afghanistan. At the time, the country was controlled by the Taliban, which had provided safe haven to Al-Qaeda and refused to hand over its leader, Osama bin Laden. On October 7, 2001, American and Allied forces began airstrikes, followed by special operations units working alongside Afghan anti-Taliban fighters. The Taliban government collapsed within weeks. Many Americans believed the war had been won, but the conflict was far from over. Taliban fighters regrouped across the border in Pakistan and launched a long insurgency that would continue for nearly 20 years, making Afghanistan the longest war in American history. While fighting continued there, the Bush administration turned its attention to another country, Iraq. President Bush argued that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, commonly known as WMDs, and warned that waiting for proof could put American lives at risk. The administration also argued that removing Saddam would eliminate a dangerous dictator and help bring stability and democracy to the Middle East. Not everyone agreed. Several allies supported military action, while others questioned the intelligence and urged that weapons inspectors be given more time. Despite the debate, the United States, together with a coalition of allies, invaded Iraq on March 20, 2003. Within 3 weeks, Baghdad had fallen. Saddam Hussein's government collapsed. In December 2003, Saddam himself was captured while hiding near his hometown. At first, many believed the conflict was over. Instead, Iraq descended into years of insurgency, sectarian violence, and terrorist attacks. As investigations continued, no active stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction were found. That discovery became one of the most controversial issues in modern American politics. Supporters argued that removing Saddam Hussein ended the rule of a brutal dictator and gave Iraq the opportunity to build a new government. Critics argued that the invasion destabilized the region, cost enormous numbers of lives, and was based on flawed intelligence. By the time George W. Bush left office in 2009, the United States had spent hundreds of billions of dollars on the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Those costs would eventually rise into the trillions of dollars over the following years as veterans' care, reconstruction, and long-term military operations continued. Thousands of American service members had lost their lives. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and Afghans had also been killed or displaced. No presidency in the 21st century has been shaped more by war than that of George W. Bush. The decisions made after September 11th transformed America's military strategy, expanded the global fight against terrorism, and sparked debates that continue more than 2 decades later. The United States had removed governments in both Afghanistan and Iraq, but the era of conflict was far from over. America's next president would inherit 2 ongoing wars and face a new generation of threats across the Middle East. By the time Barack Obama entered the White House in 2009, the United States had already spent years fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. During his campaign, Obama promised to end what he called America's endless wars. But once in office, he quickly discovered that leaving the battlefield was far more complicated than entering it. Rather than launching another large-scale ground invasion, Obama's strategy relied on a different approach: special operations forces, precision airstrikes, and an unprecedented expansion of drone warfare. His administration argued that drones could eliminate terrorist leaders with far less risk to American troops. Critics, however, warned that the growing use of drone strikes raised serious legal and ethical questions, particularly when civilians were caught in the crossfire. The most significant moment of Obama's presidency came on May 2, 2011. After years of intelligence gathering, U.S. Navy SEALs carried out a secret raid in Abbottabad, Pakistan. The mission ended with the death of Osama bin Laden, the mastermind behind the September 11th attacks. For many Americans, it was a moment of justice nearly a decade after 9/11. But the Middle East was about to enter another period of instability. In 2011, as the Arab Spring spread across North Africa, Libya descended into civil war. President Barack Obama joined a NATO-led military intervention after the United Nations authorized action to protect civilians from forces loyal to Muammar Gaddafi. The air campaign helped rebel forces overthrow Gaddafi's government. However, Libya soon fractured into rival factions, and years of instability followed. Obama later described the aftermath as one of the biggest regrets of his presidency. Then another threat emerged. In 2014, the extremist group Islamic State captured vast areas of Iraq and Syria, declaring what it called a caliphate. The group's rapid expansion, mass executions, and attacks against civilians shocked the world. Instead of deploying another massive American ground force, Obama assembled an international coalition. The United States launched thousands of airstrikes while providing intelligence, weapons, and training to local partners fighting ISIS. Over the next several years, the group lost most of the territory it had once controlled. Although ISIS was significantly weakened, it was not completely eliminated. By the end of Obama's presidency, America was no longer fighting wars in the same way it had after 9/11. Large invasions involving hundreds of thousands of troops had largely been replaced by targeted counterterrorism operations, drone strikes, special forces missions, and coalition air campaigns. For supporters, this strategy reduced American casualties while maintaining pressure on terrorist organizations. For critics, it expanded military operations into multiple countries without fully ending the conflicts that had begun years earlier. The nature of war had changed. America's next commander-in-chief would inherit those conflicts and soon make decisions that would once again place the United States at the center of a rapidly escalating crisis in the Middle East. By the time Donald Trump entered the White House in 2017, the United States had spent nearly 2 decades fighting the war on terror. Many Americans expected another president who would gradually reduce military involvement overseas. Instead, Trump's approach was very different. Rather than launching another large-scale ground war, his administration relied on military strikes, economic pressure, and targeted operations against America's adversaries. One of Trump's first major military decisions came in April 2017, after reports that the Syrian government had used chemical weapons against civilians. The United States launched dozens of Tomahawk cruise missiles against Syria's Shayrat Air Base. It was the first direct American strike against the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. A year later, another suspected chemical weapons attack triggered an even larger response. In April 2018, the United States, alongside Britain and France, carried out coordinated missile strikes against Syrian military and research facilities linked to the country's chemical weapons program. Although both operations were limited in scope, they signaled that the Trump administration was willing to use military force quickly when it believed America's interests or international norms had been crossed. But it was Trump's policy toward Iran that created the greatest tensions. In 2018, the United States withdrew from the Iran nuclear agreement and imposed sweeping economic sanctions under what the administration called its maximum pressure campaign. Relations between Washington and Tehran deteriorated rapidly. Throughout 2019, attacks on oil tankers, the downing of an American surveillance drone, and rocket attacks by Iran-backed militias pushed both countries closer to direct conflict. The turning point came on January 3, 2020. Acting on President Trump's orders, an American drone strike near Baghdad International Airport killed Qasem Soleimani, the commander of Iran's elite Quds force and one of the country's most powerful military figures. The operation stunned the world. Supporters argued that Soleimani had orchestrated attacks against American personnel and that eliminating him prevented future threats. Critics warned that the strike could trigger a full-scale war between the United States and Iran. Days later, Iran responded by launching ballistic missiles at 2 Iraqi military bases housing American troops. More than 100 U.S. service members were later diagnosed with traumatic brain injuries, but no American troops were killed in the attack. For several tense days, many feared the Middle East was on the brink of another major war. Ultimately, both sides stepped back from further escalation. Unlike previous presidents, Trump did not launch a new large-scale ground invasion. Instead, his first term was defined by precision strikes, economic sanctions, and aggressive deterrence rather than prolonged conventional warfare. Supporters argued that this approach projected American strength while avoiding another Iraq or Afghanistan. Critics countered that the escalating confrontation with Iran brought the two countries closer to war than at any point in decades. Although a wider conflict was avoided during Trump's first term, tensions in the Middle East remained unresolved. The next president would inherit those challenges while also overseeing one of the most significant military decisions of the 21st century, the final withdrawal from Afghanistan. When Joe Biden took office in January 2021, he inherited 2 decades of war, thousands of American casualties, and a public increasingly weary of military intervention. Biden had long argued that it was time to end America's longest war, but ending one conflict did not mean the United States was done with the Middle East. The defining military decision of Biden's presidency came in August 2021. After nearly 20 years of fighting, the United States completed its withdrawal from Afghanistan. As American forces departed, the Taliban rapidly swept across the country. Within days, Kabul fell. The Afghan government collapsed, and the Taliban returned to power almost exactly 20 years after being removed by American forces. The final weeks of the withdrawal were marked by scenes that shocked the world. Thousands of desperate civilians crowded Kabul's international airport, hoping to escape before the last American aircraft departed. Then tragedy struck. On August 26, 2021, a suicide bombing outside the airport killed 13 American service members and more than 170 Afghan civilians, making it one of the deadliest days for U.S. forces in the final years of the war. Although America's longest war had ended, new crises quickly emerged across the region. Throughout Biden's presidency, the United States carried out multiple airstrikes against Iran-backed militias operating in Iraq and Syria, after repeated attacks on American troops stationed there. Then, on October 7, 2023, the Middle East entered another period of instability when Hamas launched a surprise attack on Israel. The Biden administration responded by providing military assistance to Israel while deploying additional American naval forces, including aircraft carrier strike groups, to the eastern Mediterranean in an effort to deter a wider regional conflict. As the war expanded, another threat emerged. The Houthis, based in Yemen, began launching missiles and drones at commercial ships transiting the Red Sea, one of the world's busiest maritime trade routes. In response, the United States, together with several allies, launched repeated air and missile strikes against Houthi military targets while increasing its naval presence to protect international shipping. By the end of Biden's presidency, American forces were once again conducting military operations across multiple countries in the Middle East. Supporters argued these actions were necessary to protect U.S. personnel, defend key allies, and preserve freedom of navigation through one of the world's most important waterways. Critics argued that despite promises to reduce America's military footprint, the United States remained deeply involved in regional conflicts. For Joe Biden, the challenge was unlike that faced by many earlier presidents. He ended America's longest war in Afghanistan, yet found himself managing a new wave of military crises stretching from Iraq and Syria to the Red Sea and Israel. As Biden prepared to leave office, tensions with Iran and its regional allies remained unresolved. Those tensions would soon become the defining national security challenge for the next president, Donald Trump, during his second term. By the time Donald Trump returned to the White House in 2025, the Middle East was already on edge. The wars in Gaza, ongoing attacks by Iran-backed militias, and years of rising tensions between Washington and Tehran had created one of the most volatile security environments in decades. It didn't take long before the United States found itself directly confronting Iran. Throughout the first half of 2025, intelligence officials warned that Iran was continuing to expand key parts of its nuclear program, while regional hostilities intensified. At the same time, Israel launched a series of military operations targeting Iranian military and nuclear facilities, raising fears that a wider regional war was becoming unavoidable. The United States soon became directly involved. On June 21, 2025, President Donald Trump authorized precision strikes against 3 of Iran's most important nuclear facilities, including Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. The administration described the operation as a necessary step to significantly degrade Iran's nuclear capabilities and prevent the country from moving closer to developing a nuclear weapon. Iran condemned the attacks and vowed to respond. Within days, Iranian forces launched missiles toward American military installations in the region, while Iran-backed groups threatened additional attacks against U.S. personnel and allied interests. For several days, the world watched anxiously as fears of a broader regional war dominated international headlines. Global oil prices fluctuated sharply, governments issued travel warnings, and diplomats rushed to prevent the crisis from escalating further. Despite the exchange of military strikes, both Washington and Tehran signaled that they wanted to avoid a prolonged full-scale war. Over the following months, indirect negotiations, regional mediation, and periods of ceasefire helped reduce the immediate risk of a larger conflict, although tensions remained high throughout 2025 and into 2026. Supporters of Trump's actions argued that the strikes demonstrated American resolve and dealt a significant blow to Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Critics warned that direct military action against Iran risked igniting another long and unpredictable conflict in the Middle East. As of 2026, the long-term consequences of those decisions are still unfolding. Whether the strikes prevented a larger conflict, or merely delayed one, is a question that historians may debate for years to come. From James Madison's declaration of war against Britain in 1812 to Donald Trump's strikes on Iran more than 2 centuries later, every generation of American presidents has faced the same burden, deciding when and whether to use military force. Some wars preserved the nation, others expanded its power, and some continue to shape the world even today.